Right, so we're basically going to go through some of the kind of basic nutritional foundations for optimizing body composition in relation to muscle and strength, or just getting a bit leaner, or putting on some weight. If we go to the next slide, please. So put things in kind of context before we start. We're going to base everything off a pyramid, where the base will be the most important aspect, and we go up in kind of stages in relevance of importance. This only kind of applies when you have the foundations kept. So you have a lot of kind of finite detail with nutrition, and the kind of nuances of that only apply when you have these foundations actually already in place. So they're going to be the kind of cornerstones that you're basing everything else off. This industry in specific is full of a lot of dogma, kind of, you could call it folklore, I guess, or some people call it bro science, whatever you want to call it, littering kind of information platforms available to you online or on print media or papers or whatever. This is basically here to try and put some context over what's going to be applicable for you, and what is kind of based on evidential content that's going to be, useful for you when you're ciphering through information available. So we're going to go through some of the basic drivers that will help you optimize body composition. So like I said, there's 5 specific things, and we base it on a pyramid. So the idea being that the base of the pyramid is the most important, and each one's going to be reliant on one another, and we're going to go up in kind of order there. Nutrition is very individualistic, so for this we're kind of basing this on somebody, an individual or a demographic that's going to be fairly metabolically functional, and there's not going to be quote unquote anything wrong with them. For certain demographics with more underlying issues, whether that be weight or metabolic issues, the prioritising of nutritional factors may differ, which we'll touch at the end. So if you had, for example, a severely overweight client, or somebody that had some form of metabolic issue or hormonal issue or imbalance, then we might structure this differently. Like I said, it's individualistic to everyone, so we'll cover that at the end. But at the moment, we're going to look at the basics for the bulk majority of people. And again, with nutrition or changing your physique or gaining weight or losing body fat, sustainability and adherence is the most important thing. So if you're not going to stick to something, and you're trying to follow a regime which you can't be compliant with over the long run, then it's essentially not going to be as beneficial as a framework that works and you can stick to. So adherence is going to be of paramount importance when you're looking at nutritional protocols. Essentially, if you're trying to put something in place and you can't follow it through consistently, then you will get a short bout of results, and then you're going to regress back to your previous state. And if you look at the body from a physiological perspective, it's very adaptable, and it will adapt to change. Now, most of the time, the adaptable response is a favourable thing. Your body becomes metabolically efficient, but the pitfalls are, once you make those changes, you're going to essentially have to keep them there or sustain them if you're not careful to stay at that level of conditioning or weight or whatever. So we need to make adjustments that are realistic and that you can actually cope with in the long run. So, pyramid. Like I said, base, most important, and then the peak would be the least important. So we'll go through each one individually in a bit more depth, but they're basically proceeding on from one another. So the most important thing in terms of body composition for the majority of people is going to be overall energy balance and your caloric intake. So that's going to make the difference between losing, gaining, or maintaining weight. And then we go into the more specific things. So we're looking at macronutrient partitioning or distribution for your calories. So what your calories are going to be comprised of with protein, carbs and fats, and fibre intake. We've got micronutrients, which is basically the nutrient density of your food composition, water, so hydration. One above that, we've got nutrient timing and meal frequency. So the timing of nutrients throughout the day, when you're placing specific foods and how that can benefit you. And then the least of all, still beneficial, but in the grand context of things, would be supplements at the top. So that's the kind of order we're going to follow. Again, the base being the most important and the top being the least important. But again, they all proceed from one another, so they're all important, but in different ways and different kind of volumes. So energy balance. So calories in versus calories out, or the basic laws of thermodynamics. From a layman's perspective, in layman's terms, breaking it down to a very basic kind of concept, the amount of calories that you're taking on board and expending, and that kind of balance like a seesaw, is going to ultimately be your energy balance, and that's going to decipher whether you're gaining, losing, or maintaining body weight. Like I said, we're all subject to the basic laws of thermodynamics. So this is particularly relevant when you want to lose body fat or lose weight, but it's the same for gaining weight as well. So overall net energy of the system, i.e. our bodies, are ultimately going to dictate whether our energy reserves are going to need to be mobilized to support a surplus of energy demand. So essentially, if you look at our bodies, if we're exercising, which would be output, over what we're taking in, that demand is going to shift to a deficit, and you'll essentially lose weight or drop body fat. So it's a fine balance that we kind of strike there. There are a lot of traditional formulas that you can use, which we'll go into in a bit greater depth in a minute. And basically, for weight loss in specific, we want to basically try to maintain the highest caloric content we can whilst progressing and still losing weight. And the same for weight gain. It's the smallest amount of surplus that we can get away with whilst progressing and gaining weight. Again, short surplus or deficit is going to be better for you in the long run for health and body composition. So if we look at a formula, Mifflin formula or equation is the kind of most up-to-date kind of formula that you can use. There are a couple of others, but I quite like this one. This is working out your BMR, so your basal metabolic rate. It's essentially breaking down the amount of calories or energy that your body needs to function, which is at rest, so no exercise at all. If you were laying in bed, the amount of calories that your body would need to perform very basic ground level tasks, so basically staying alive, basic vital bodily functions, that number would be your BMR. So for men, the equation is pretty long-winded and pretty boring, but it's a useful tool to work as an estimate to start at. So men and women are going to differ. Once we've worked out BMR, so it's basically taking into account your weight, your height, your age, and a few other things that we'll go on to in the next slide. Once you've worked out your basal metabolic rate, which is again just supporting basic bodily functions instead of accounting for exercise, that estimate then leads on to total daily energy expenditure. So that accounts for the thermic effect of activity. So when you're exercising, how many calories you're burning when you're exercising or playing sport or training or walking to work or whatever, and the thermic effect of feeding. So the energy demand of the actual foods that you're digesting and absorbing. So different foods have different thermic effects, and they'll kind of consume or use more calories. Protein, carbs and fats are all different. And that's the process of digesting food is going to take up caloric content as well. So if you go on to the next slide, Han, we've got an example. So let's call him Gary. Gary's male, he's 85 kilograms, he's 182 centimeters tall. So we've got our two data points there. He's 22 years old, so we've got our age. Somatotypes can come into it, so ectomorphs, mesomorphs, endomorphs, so that's kind of like body types, and you can use them as a guide to kind of guide your way of approaching nutrition, which again we'll cover in a minute. He's going to exercise on average 5 times a week, so we kind of have a bulk idea of the amount of calories he's probably consuming in a week, and he's got an active job. So say he's a labourer instead of an office job, he's going to generally be burning more calories throughout the day on average. And Gary wants to gain muscle mass, or he wants to put on weight. So to work out his BMR, so basal metabolic rate, to perform basically nothing, just to survive, Gary would equate that, and it will give him 1,883 calories. So that's basically metabolic rate. So we then attribute that to total daily energy expenditure. So we're looking at the thermic effect of activity and feeding. That's going to range from, once you've got your BMR, I'd say around 500 to 1,500 calories based on the circumstance. So we know he's exercising 5 times a week. He's got an active job. He's mesomorphic, so he's going to be quite predispositioned to have quite a lot of lean mass. So gaining lean mass and maintaining lean mass is very metabolically expensive. So he needs quite a few calories to make that stick around. So we'll put him at 1,250, which is kind of ballpark top end range. Again, be conservative with that because you can always change it later. So it gives us a maintenance calories of 3,133 per day, or you can break that into, basically times it by 7 and look at the week of just over 2,100. What I'd basically do is have a 14-day food log. So I get Gary to fill out a food diary for me, which gives me a kind of snapshot of his diet and how many calories he's taken on before he comes to me and works with me. 14 days, around 2 weeks, is going to give me a rough idea. And I'd take the average of his daily consumption of calories. I'd take that number and I'd find a middle balance. So we're not going to put him up too high initially. We can slowly work him up to it, or we can bring him down as needed. So we adjust depending on the two numbers. If you go on to the next slide, Han. So that would be the calorie side of it. Number 2, second part of that pyramid, we're looking at macronutrient composition and fiber. So energy balance provides that bottom layer, and then we kind of work on top of that. Macronutrient composition of a diet can heavily influence body composition from the muscle side, so the muscle development side. If we want to build lean mass, build tissue, then the composition of a caloric content in terms of splitting that between protein, carbs and fats will make quite a big impact. So you can kind of provide the body with substrates, food or food groups that are going to boost performance, kind of muscle building stimulants, and boost recovery. So things that are going to be available to repair tissue as well. We kind of govern that on, for example, protein intake is going to have a significant impact on muscle protein synthesis and maximizing that, and obviously protein accretion. So if we want to build tissue, we place macronutrients according to that. Protein, carbs and fats would make up your 3 macronutrients, and they're going to be holding individual caloric values, so they're all going to be different as well. If you pop the next slide on. So protein. Fundamentally, protein is what your body makes up: cells, organs and tissues. It's a building block. It's essential for hormonal health, cellular function and energy. Should we wish to kind of adapt the body physiologically, so gain muscle mass, we're going to require above baseline level amounts of protein to ensure A, positive protein balance, and B, maximize protein synthesis, muscle protein synthesis, which are 2 of the main aspects for gaining tissue. Like we said, they've all got, to a degree, different caloric values. Protein and carbohydrates are the same. So protein yields 4 calories per gram. So for every 1 gram of protein you're eating, it's going to equate to 4 calories worth of caloric value. So we're going to start with that. So I'd always start with protein. So you've got your 3,133 calories for Gary. We're going to always start with protein being the main macronutrient that we work out first, to ensure an adequate supply of amino acids to support muscle protein synthesis. Gary wants to gain muscle mass, so it's going to be very important, and kind of leverage the other aspects, the beneficial aspects of protein that can handle that. So protein's got quite a high thermic effect in terms of your body consuming energy to digest it and assimilate it. 5 times greater than carbs and fats, so it's going to be a bit more apparent there, and it's highly satiating. So for somebody that wants to lose body fat or lose weight, it's quite an effective tool to have that quite high in their caloric value to keep them full, but also they're going to be burning more energy by actually digesting the food as well. Literature kind of doesn't support adequately a protein intake really more than 1 gram per pound of body weight. More isn't often greater, so I'd range protein intake from 1 gram to 1.3 grams per pound of body weight. Gary would be on the higher end because he's a mesomorph, he's male, he's exercising a lot, and that's kind of what you're going to need from that if you pop that up. So next we've got fat. Essential for cholesterol production, hormone regulation, cellular structure, energy and joint health, so it's going to lubricate joints. If we kind of skimp out on fat, we're going to experience in the long run huge health dysfunction and serious nutritional issues. The kind of Atkins diets and all of the kind of mad, really low fat diets that came around kind of 10, 15 years ago are based on the fact that fat yields the highest caloric value. So fat has 9 calories per gram as opposed to a protein or a carb that has 4. So if we take fat away or reduce it, we're taking the main bulk of calories away from a diet. So essentially low fat diets came about by saying we've got the largest bulk of calories coming from fat, so we'll just reduce fat so you can continue to eat more food or a higher amount of food on fewer calories. Again, big drawbacks in terms of health when you kind of cut fats too low. Typically, for most people, fat should comprise about 20 to 30% of the diet. So your total calories should be about 20 to 30%, and then you'd be in the right range. If we look at protein and fats together, those are the macronutrients that we essentially need to survive. That's why they're subcategorized into essential amino acids and essential fatty acids. So they are essential to the body, and the body has an inability to create them. So you should view those two as, in essence, the two most important macronutrients. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll go on to carbs. So carbs basically provide a kind of immediate direct energy substrate for sustaining training intensity, performance, so saturating glycogen stores and replenishment of glycogen. And it prevents, to an extent, muscle degradation, so catabolism. Carbs have a direct stimulation of anabolism because of the insulin response. So they're quite a good route to go down if we're trying to sustain a level of training intensity or volume throughout the week, and B, if we're trying to gain tissue for most people. So same as protein, carbs have 4 calories per gram. And like we said, it's going to be essentially our primary fuel substrate. So it should be assigned according to activity level. If you're very active, you could probably get away with eating a few more carbs and sustaining the activity that you're on. And we've also got a kind of a counter for insulin tolerance and intolerance. So your carb tolerance is going to be very individualistic. So depending on insulin resistance in terms of putting carbs into cells and putting them where they should be when you digest them, it's going to be completely individualistic based on the individual. So we'll assign that towards how they're going to kind of respond to a carb intake. Again, we'll go on that a bit later on. The more intolerant will be placed on a lower end of the caloric slack. If you're tolerant to carbs, we're going to put them up a bit higher. If you go on to the next slide, Han. So fourth one, 3 macronutrients done. Fiber is also really important. So it can be categorized into soluble fiber, which is basically going to dissolve into water and become almost like a gel-like substance. And insoluble, which is basically there to promote a healthy digestive system and increases kind of stool bulk to keep everything moving. Fiber is pretty important. So a lot of people wouldn't think it's kind of the most important thing, but if you skimp on fiber, you're going to be cutting yourself short. In terms of bowel function, for one, blood glucose levels, so keeping that fairly stable throughout the day, blood cholesterol, blood lipid levels, and it's fiber satiating. So if we're looking at a diet from a kind of mental perspective, the more fiber you're taking on board, within reason, the fuller you're going to be. So if you're on a fat loss diet, fiber can be quite useful from things like vegetables or fibrous carbs to keep you full without you feeling hungry throughout the day. Hop on to the next slide. So we've got Gary at the top with all of our kind of information that we need. So height, weight, age, his somatotype to give us a rough idea of how we're going to place him, exercise level, so his expenditure, and what he wants to do. We worked out his BMR, and then we worked out the thermic effects of food and feeding. So we've got 31, 33. And then we're going to put him in a surplus because he wants to gain muscle mass, he wants to put on weight. So like I said, be more conservative. So I put him in deficits or surplus to start at kind of 300 to 500 calories. So he's got what he needs to survive. What he needs to survive. Then he's got the thermic effects, so his energy level, and that's basically going to be his maintenance calories. So total daily energy expenditure is what he's going to eat every day, and essentially estimating not gain any weight or lose any weight. Then we put him on a 300 calorie surplus to make him start gaining weight, which gives us 3,433. So we know he's a mesomorph. So mesomorphic individuals have a medium-sized bone structure. They're normally quite athletic. They're active throughout the day, which we know Gary is. They're quite testosterone and growth hormone dominant, so they're going to be good for gaining muscle mass and maintaining that muscle mass at a lower percentage of body fat. Mesomorphs normally have a good protein tolerance, so we know he's active and we know he needs to gain muscle mass, so we put him at the top end of the spectrum. Don't use percentages when you're measuring protein content, because if we used, for example, somatotype percentages, would say a mesomorph would typically be 40% of his caloric intake from protein. That would give him a protein intake of above 300 grams, which we said 1 to 1.3 grams is fine, so it's going to be quite excessive. So don't use percentages, use just based on body weight for protein. Carb tolerance is going to be good. Not as good as an ectomorph, but it's going to be better than an endomorph. So we'll give them a good amount of carbs, and fat content's always going to be in that 20 to 30% range. So we've got, where are we? 3,433 is the number we're playing with to make them gain weight. Protein is going to be broken down, so we're going to give them 1.3 grams per pound, which is a decent amount of protein, 243 grams of protein, which equates to 972 calories. Fat, we'll give them 90%, which is 25%, so it's more than adequate to sustain kind of hormonal function, etc. And carbs are going to be moderate again, 412, which is going to A, be anabolic, and B, kind of help him sustain his training intensity. And then for fibre, we're looking at per 1,000 calories, you want to give him about 10 grams of fibre. So if he's on just under 3,500, we're going to give him between 30 and 35. And that's essentially how you'd work out A, calories, and B, macronutrients, in layman's terms. So the third point will be micronutrients, food composition or food quality, and water, so hydration. Micronutrients is essentially kind of vitamin, mineral intake, phytonutrients, etc. So that's going to be really important for kind of energy production, hemoglobin synthesis, bone health, immune function, preventing the body against oxidative stress, especially if you're exercising a lot, and assisting the synthesis and repair of muscle tissue, so recovery. If you're training a lot, again, metabolic pathways where micronutrients are required, a lot of exercise stresses those pathways, so it may result in muscle biomechanical adaptations, which kind of increases the need for a solid micronutrient intake. If you look at things like dieting processes like If It Fits Your Macros, you might have heard of that, or flexible dieting, which has kind of been blown massively out of proportion. They focus on calories and macronutrients, and kind of it's become quite apparent that micronutrients is being kind of put to one side and not really focused on that importantly. But in the grand scheme of things, this stays very important as a kind of factor. If you go on to the next slide, Han. So the one where a lot of the IFYM, If It Fits Your Macros dieting cuts short on is food quality, and food quality is still very, very important. So for the most part, we want to kind of base our diet largely around single ingredient foods. So foods that are essentially what they are, and they haven't been processed with, tampered with, had any stuff pumped into them. They are in a natural form, minimally processed. That's going to essentially kind of secure maximum nutrient bioavailability, and it's going to have the natural enzymes into you digest them, absorb them, and assimilate them. So it is what it is. You are what you absorb. So you need to take into consideration, although some people don't say it's as important, the farming, rearing or growing processes of foods, so organic foods, wild caught, grass fed, it's still really important. So try and get the best quality stuff you can. And essentially for digesting and absorbing nutrients, so you don't constantly build up intolerances, just rotate your food sources. So have a wide variety of foods that you're going to eat, and keep that rotating. So just don't focus the diet on specific foods for a long period of time. Trying to get maximum variety in there so you can capitalize on a wider variety of nutrients. Science aside, optimizing food quality, essentially in relation to strength, muscle, body composition, is going to lower inflammation. So the better food quality you're taking on board, it's going to increase our recovery ability by minimizing inflammation from food, from bad food that we want to try and avoid. So trans fats, really kind of erratic blood sugar levels. It's going to improve gut health. The immune system's housed in the gut, so essentially that's essential for health in the long run. And digestion. So if you're focusing the majority of your food on unprocessed single ingredient food, the chances are your digestion is going to be pretty optimal. So nutrient absorption is going to be good. So you're capitalizing on the foods you're actually eating. It's pointless slamming a load of food to gain weight if you're not actually absorbing the nutrients you're taking on board. And it's going to minimize any GI issues, so stomach discomfort, bloating, etc. Those three things are going to have a massive correlation to long-term health, maximizing long-term health, performance, and therefore body composition. So less stalling within the process of gaining weight or losing body fat, and it's going to be more sustainable in the long run. So still very important. And then water. So hydration levels are really important for performance, but also mental, cognitive function throughout the day. I'd say ballpark range, 35 milliliters per kilogram of body weight as a kind of base level, as a minimum, and then build on top of that. So if you're exercising and sweating as well, you're going to be expending water. You want to replenish that. So 35 milliliters per kilo is basic minimum levels. Anything above that's fine as well, within reason. So fourth importance, or the fourth one preceding from the third, is nutrient timing and meal frequency. So if we look at food, we can time food around certain sweet spots throughout the day, around physical activity to kind of optimize things. And we look at the relative duration between meals as well. There's a lot of kind of things that have been historically postulated suggesting the avoidance of entire food groups throughout the day at different times. Largely this has been disproved. So for example, don't eat carbs at night, or only eat carbs in the morning, etc. That's going to be stored as body fat. It's mostly just dogma. Your overall caloric intake and the total amount of nutrients that you're taking on board throughout the day is going to be the biggest determining factor on health and body composition. Because of physical activity and the dynamic physiological response to extensive physical activity, there's going to be, like I said, certain sweet spots throughout the day which you can optimize the utility of nutrients. And they're essentially before and after exercise or around exercise. So you've probably heard of the anabolic window around training, largely being discredited, but it's still there that we can capitalize on. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not massively important. If you want to optimize everything, it's a factor we can get better at as well, and optimizing stimulus and recovery ratio. So I'd say, as a rough estimate, for carb intake, which is a fuel substrate, you're going to place about 40 to 60% pre and post workout respectively, and both of those feedings are going to have around 30 grams of protein in, quality single ingredient protein, which is going to yield kind of adequate leucine content with both of those meals. Between kind of meal duration, so the time that you're spacing meals out throughout the day, anywhere between 2 and 3.5 hours seems to be optimal to kind of leverage a physiological response, so maximize muscle protein synthesis. But in the grand scheme of things, that would be optimizing it perfectly. somewhere between 3 and 5 hours is also absolutely fine. So it's not going to make a massive difference, but if you're looking for very finite details, 2 to 3.5 is probably the best. 3 to 5 is going to be fine as well. And then we're looking at the top one. So supplements. A supplement is essentially what it says. It's to supplement an already established diet. So it complements something that's already there. You don't build a diet around supplements, you build supplements around the diet. So it's essentially covering our backs in terms of if we have any deficiencies in any kind of nutrient. And there's kind of a priority list. The two most important aspects would essentially be a fish oil is again really important if we're not getting adequate omega-3 intake from diet. Kind of increasing cell permeability to nutrients. Fish oil is very anti-inflammatory, which again can have a big knock-on effect to recovery when you're training. And a multivitamin, so making sure that any micronutrient deficiencies are covered. But again, it's a supplement to an already established diet. Whey protein can be useful. So if you're tolerant to whey and lactose, it's a fantastic way of supplementing amino acids in your diet. Again, timing it around training, a food option would be perfectly fine. But whey protein's a highly absorbable biological value protein that can stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and it's got a high leucine content. Creatine, again, really well researched supplement, probably one of the only supplements that has a solid backing against it in terms of strength and power, and helping fuel ATP, PC, short-term energy systems, kind of prolonging premature muscle fatigue, and explosive contractile movement. So around 5 grams per day would be about optimal for that. Branched chain amino acids is basically a broken down form of protein. Again, can help with muscle protein synthesis. So banging that around training, or if you don't have time to eat, feedings throughout the day, it's going to take you a longer time to eat, then again, that can be quite useful. Glutamine plays again a role in protein synthesis. Can improve gut health. There's been some studies linking it to that, and kind of immune system function and health, because it's housed in the gut. So again, recovery and overall gut health, glutamine could be a good option to look at. ZMA, especially for recovery, promoting restful night's sleep, so taking that in the evenings. It's basically magnesium, vitamin B6 and zinc, and it's also going to kind of optimize immune function, testosterone production. Again, 2 really important parts. And then you've got some vitamins as well. So D3, it's a big hormonal precursor. Vitamin C, again, boosting immune system. It's going to lower LPA and help the arteries stay thin and strong over the long run, which is good for overall health. B12, so blood health in the nervous system, optimally functioning and memory function as well. Calcium, you've all heard it, skin, bone and joint health. And curcumin, which is a kind of relatively new on the block that's been focused on now, which is basically supporting inflammatory processes within the body. So if you're training a lot and you're predispositioned to become inflamed because of the stress that's being placed on your body, it can be a really good thing to look at. And then other considerations, you've got kind of pre and probiotic compounds to help you digest, absorb and assimilate nutrients. So again, quite important. GDAs, which is kind of like a glucose disposal agent. So you can look at, they're normally comprised of cinnamon, chromium and alpha lipoic acid, which again helps carbs be put into cells. So if you've got a particularly poor carb tolerance or you're insulin resistant, a glucose disposal agent supplement can be helpful, taking it on board with carbs to help you put that in cells, to minimize the storage of body fat and adipose tissue. Intra-workout carb sources, so highly branched cyclic dextrin or Vitago, so fast-acting, high molecular weights, low osmolality carbs, which are basically going to be digested easily and passed through the body and digested and absorbed. Again, around training to kind of maximize that anabolic environment and minimize protein degradation. If you're trying to gain muscle mass, it can be very important, but again, overall diet's the most important, then we optimize where we can or where we want to, depending on that. And kind of you all heard it like pre-workouts, nitric oxide precursors, things like citrulline malate or arginine, etc. that's going to promote blood flow and performance. Again, quite small performance indicators, but again, in the overall picture, if you want to maximise every aspect, they can be stuff that you can look into too. Key considerations for kind of going on your journey or the route that you're going to take nutritionally for you. If you look at the kind of hare and tortoise race, in theory, the tortoise with this would win. So you want to employ slow, sustainable changes, nothing extreme, because the body is almost likely going to reject that in the long run. Take into consideration the kind of negative aspects of approaching this suboptimally. So unsustainability. So anything you do nutritionally, if it's unsustainable and you can't see yourself doing this in the long run, you know, you're going to get to A, but you're going to regress because you're not going to maintain it. And the chances of you kind of reaching that destination, quote unquote, broken, physically, fatigue-wise or metabolically, is quite high. Physiological damage of extreme change on your kind of metabolic biochemistry of your body. Your body's going to adapt to chronic extremes and make a series of fixable adjustments to the way it's processing and the way it's adapting. If you do this too often, the adaptations can become permanent and harder to reverse. And then mental damage. So any kind of situation where you're changing body composition, losing weight, getting very, very lean, or kind of gaining muscle tissue or gaining weight, we're developing associations, behaviours and habits around food and body image. And this has become really apparent kind of in the last couple of years when more people are kind of competing on a physique level as well. And it's become more fixated around the kind of aesthetic side of training and nutrition. So people wanting to look better essentially. These are often negative associations and patterns of eating that can become very physically and mentally damaging. So we just need to play it carefully on kind of food restriction and breaking down things onto a basic level to keep balance and keep you in a kind of healthy mind state too. And kind of, we need to kind of consider for physique athletes or people looking to get very lean as well, that kind of true conditioning that you're attaining at very low levels of body fat, you should be viewing that as a holiday destination and not your new home. So it's not sustainable and you're not going to be there for very long. Once it's been done, your photo shoot's been done or you've competed, you want to get yourself back to normal physiological, a normal physiological state and optimize kind of your adrenals and your hormonal health as soon as possible once that's done. So those are kind of key considerations and where not to go wrong when you're planning stuff out. And then last point, we spoke at the start about context for all of this. So when you're looking at an individual from a nutritional perspective and what you prioritize with nutrition and that hierarchy, it's going to depend on that person in specific. So kind of hormonal profiles, your metabolic state, insulin resistant, carb tolerance, your current body composition, so you know your weight and what your physical state is at the moment, and then previous nutritional and lifestyle habits and even emotional state are going to all govern what you prioritize first. So in specific situations, although they are more rare, for example, if there's a client coming to me with a significant weight issue, they have metabolic issues, that can be hormonally or insulin issues, and they have a very poor carb tolerance, they're insulin resistant from years of previous nutritional and lifestyle habits, they're looking to lose body fat and weight, then we'd probably break that down, the hierarchy, into slightly different order. So instead of just being completely fixated on calories, we probably place more of an emphasis on looking at what we're actually eating as opposed to what's in it. So we're looking at the quality of food, looking at unprocessed nutrient-dense food sources to try and make that change initially, and then making sure they've got adequate levels of macronutrients from that. The most important thing is looking at how those foods and how foods they're consuming are disrupting their hormonal state. So we're trying to control that. In this case, they're going to be very sensitive because of those kind of points there. So The main focus for us would be to regulate and control insulin and the hormones that respond to it accordingly. And then we look at food turnover, so the frequency of feeding, trying to up-regulate their food frequency a tiny bit more throughout the day, and put them in more of an anabolic environment so they can start to build muscle mass and they can start to fuel training and up-regulate metabolic rate. The priority initially wouldn't be to solely focus on calories like the pyramid would suggest. For this individual, for some certain circumstances, calories may already be low as well. The priority would more be based upon fixing quote-unquote a broken body and slowly regaining basic functions that have impaired them or been down-regulated by their previous habits in the past. And that will be the key to their weight loss. So like I said, with nutrition, yes, that hierarchy and pyramid can be really useful, but it's completely individualistic and it depends on the individual. So you've got to assess kind of where they're coming from and how you'd approach it. And no two people realistically are going to be the same.